Thank you so much for joining us. My name is George Hurtt. I'm here with the intellectual giant that is Dr. Marvin McMickle. I want to thank him on a busy schedule, even during this pandemic. We just talked about some things that he's already doing during this time to be with us. And we are talking about prophetic preaching during a pandemic. I was led to have this wonderful guest on with us in light of an article that I got a hold of that he wrote. And there's so many things that he have written. Just last night, someone was listing the top 10 books of all time and saw his name up there on the book that he wrote, Passing Under Pressure, I think it was, or something of that nature. I'll pull that up. And so sadly and embarrassingly, I'm new to his work of recent, but we're going to make up from old time, and we have already ordered a lot of in that. Thank you again, sir. Let me begin by just asking you for those that may be like myself, not as familiar with you as they ought to be, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes. I spent 34 years as a pastor, 10 years in Montclair, New Jersey, 24 years here in Cleveland at Antioch Baptist Church. Before that, I spent 4 years with Sam Proctor at Abyssinian Baptist Church on the staff there.
Yes, sir.
And before that, 2 years with Bill Jones at Bethany Baptist Church in Brooklyn, New York. So I've been in and around the ministry now 1 year short of 50 years. I was licensed by Bill Jones in 1971. So come 2021, I'll be 50 years at this work.
Congratulations.
But in addition to all of that, in 1966, I spent a summer with Martin Luther King Jr. when he came to Chicago for the open housing campaign that he led there. So all my life has been church-centered, but also with an angle on social justice issues. I went to Union Seminary in 1970 when James Cone first arrived at Union. So between King in 66, Cone in 70, Bill Jones in 71, Sam Proctor in 72, my own ministry, I've been at this angle of preaching with an edge toward the prophetic issue for a good long while.
Wow. I'm just curious. Tell me about the time in 66 in Chicago. If I remember that right, King was received very violently there.
King said that he'd never seen hatred anywhere like he saw in Chicago. And, you know, those of us who lived there knew it. But he was trying to make the point that racism, but more importantly, segregation as a social practice was not just a Southern phenomenon, but it was in fact a national issue. And in 1966, the foremost racially segregated cities in the country, in this order, were Chicago, Detroit, Cleveland, and Gary, Indiana.
Wow.
There's not one Southern city that had the percentage of neighborhood segregation that those four northern cities had. So he wanted to dramatize that. And you're right, he was assaulted several times in Chicago. During our marches, we saw for the first time American Nazis waving Nazi banners. We saw Confederate flags flying in Chicago.
Wow.
2 years earlier, in 1964, the rule was that you could work in certain places in Chicago, but you couldn't live there. But once your shift was over, you had to hurry up and get out of Dodge. A man in our church worked at a steel mill in Cicero, just outside Chicago, which was a mafia area. That's where Al Capone used to live. He stopped at a red light to take some pipe tobacco out of his trunk and then get back in his car. In the time it took him to get out of his car, in his trunk, and close his trunk, he was approached from behind by some local persons who hit him in the head with a baseball bat, and he eventually died from that assault. There was never an arrest, never an investigation, never a trial. The explanation was he should have known better than to be there.
Wow.
That was Chicago in 1964.
Chicago. While we're on that subject, where were you in '68 on that dark day, and how did you hear about the news?
Yeah, I was in college. I went to school 60 miles west of Chicago in a town called Aurora, Illinois, Aurora College. Everybody knew that I spent the summer of '66 with King and was involved in civil rights efforts in Aurora as well. So I was walking across the campus, heading toward the dining hall, and someone leaned out a window and said to me, "Your man has just been shot." That's all they said. "Your man has just been shot." I wasn't sure what that meant at the time, but by the time I got to the dining hall, the word was spreading not only that he had been shot, but that he had now died. So we organized a memorial service that night and a larger one 2 or 3 days later. Went back to Chicago that weekend, and the city was in flames.
Wow.
The last thing he would have wanted to mark his death would have been a riot, but that's exactly what happened in cities and towns all across the country. And I think Jesse Jackson put it well when he said, America did not know it, but they just killed their last best chance for a peaceful resolution to America's historic problem of racism. And I think that proved to be the case. The death of Martin King, while it did not end civil rights activities, I think put a major pause on what had been going on up to that time. Voting Rights Act, Civil Rights Act of 1964. It was a tragedy, and I was very much a part of that.
Well, and so in '70, you're headed to Union.
Right.
How was that time there, and what ultimately led you to choose to study there?
Well,
and the book that I was referencing was Caring Pastors, Caring People.
Caring Pastors, Caring People. Oh, thank you. Good. I went to Union because James Cone was already there, and his book Black Theology and Black Power had come out in 1969. So I knew I wanted to study with him on that topic. When I got to New York, I also joined Bethany Baptist Church in Brooklyn because Bill Jones, in addition to being the pastor, was president of Operation Breadbasket, which was an SCLC affiliate dealing with economic boycotts against major corporations that weren't hiring Blacks at the management level. So I got involved in demonstrations, got arrested a few times in New York City. By that time, Wyatt T. Walker, who was one of Dr. King's closest allies, was a pastor in Manhattan. So I was surrounded by civil rights activists. So between the legacy of King, the teachings of Cone, the activities of Operation Breadbasket, and life in New York City. I mean, New York is its own place with its own problems. Abyssinian is located at 138th between 7th Avenue and Lenox. Muhammad's Temple number 7, which is where Malcolm X was and where Louis Farrakhan was at that time, was on 116th and Lenox. And we knew that every Sunday, somebody was coming to Abyssinian to give Jesus one last chance to make sense to them before they went down the street to Farrakhan at 3 o'clock and joined the nation. So we had to make the gospel relevant in New York City in the 1970s. And so between Sam Proctor, who was the pastor, Bill Epps, who was the senior associate, myself and Calvin Butts, our job was to try to resist the allure, the popularity, the eloquence of Farrakhan, which was not easy. in 1972 because he was a force to be reckoned with. But that was our assignment. Wyatt Walker was on 116th Street, 1/2 block from Farrakhan. So Farrakhan cast a shadow over the entire New York City church community because folks who really didn't see the progress of civil rights and were losing patience were finding in him a voice of a certain attractiveness.
Mm. What was your strategy? In Wilmette, was that a Second Baptist in LA that you were speaking of?
Yeah, Bill Epps, who's now at Second Baptist in LA, but
yeah,
at that time he was still at Abyssinian, left
New York, yeah,
there to go to North Carolina, left there to go to Detroit, then went out to Los Angeles.
What was your
Epps,
strategy to spread the gospel?
well, that was it. Spread the gospel, but spread the gospel of liberation. In other words, we were the first New York City interpreters at Abyssinian of what Cone was saying about God and the oppressed, and about God on the side of the oppressed, and about how the gospel has to have relevance for people who are on the underside of life, or as Howard Thurman would say, the person with their back against the wall. So in a very real sense, we were taking lectures from Cone and C. Eric Lincoln and Lawrence Jones during the week and bringing them straight to the pulpit at Abyssinian. Now, the thing of it was that Sam Proctor was a part-time pastor, meaning he never preached every Sunday. So we had access to the church twice a month between us. So we had many opportunities to sort of talk about the gospel from the point of view of its stories and messages and themes about justice, about liberation, about caring for the destitute and the poor, who were all around us in Harlem in those days. So it was a laboratory where the theology we learned in school and the gospel we read on Sunday could be worked out in very real places: housing programs, hunger programs, and social advocacy with governmental agencies.
Okay, housing programs, or social programs. Was there ever any encounters with them? Any one-on-one encounters? Anything?
With whom?
The Nation of Islam at that time.
Oh, sure, yeah. I mean, listen, I would go down there myself at 3 o'clock to hear. You know, you've got to know what your opposition is saying in order to counter it. There was never any sense of antipathy or anger. They never, for a second, made any, sort of threatening comments to us or anybody else. They were just the alternative message. There's always been, from the founding of the country, parallel messages. There was always Frederick Douglass, who wanted to stay here, and Cromwell, who wanted to go back to Africa. There was always Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois. There was always Jesse Jackson and Louis Farrakhan. And people have to navigate for themselves in which direction they want to go, based upon the level of hope that they have in the message that they're hearing before they get lured into something else. But Farrakhan could not be avoided in New York City. On the radio, speaking in churches all the time. He knew the Bible better than most Black Baptist preachers did. Right. It's just that there would be about a 10% exegesis that he would apply that turned things specifically into an anti-Christian church message. If you want to be free, it's never going to happen if you stay in that white man's church. Our job was to say, before it was a white man's church. Here's a text I want to give to your listeners in Acts chapter 13, because this was the text I always used when I talked with them. I said in Acts chapter 13, it says there were 4 elders in the church at Antioch, and their names were, 2 of them, Barnabas and Saul, and the others were Simeon the Niger and Lucius of Cyrene. Then I asked folks to do a little geography. Simeon the Niger, that is a word in Latin that means black. and Lucius of Cyrene. That is a country in North Africa that is modern day Libya. So in the early church, there were two men of Greco-Roman origin, Barnabas and Paul, and two men of direct African origin, one of whom was so dark they called him by the name Niger. So if you had, now, then it goes on to say, and the two black men ordained the two Greek men. They laid their hands on them. So I don't concede that Christianity is a white person's religion when the people who ordained the first evangelists were men from Africa. And we have to read the Bible in such a way as to read ourselves into the text, which then makes it hard for somebody else to preach us out of the church. That's our job, you see, is to read the scripture in such a way as to see the truth of who really was in the Bible at that time, at the very beginning. Simeon, the Niger, Lucius of Cyrene, Acts 13.
There it is. There it is. Before we go back, get to your journey out of New York, I want to stay in New York just a little bit longer. This is post the Harlem Renaissance. Is there still some residue of that? What's the temperature of New York City, and how is that set the tone?
Yeah, no, the Renaissance did not survive the Depression.
Right.
Yeah, it was booming from about 1922 to about 1932, but you know, economic realities became what they were, and pretty quickly the Renaissance gave way. There's a wonderful book about Du Bois by a man named David Levering Lewis. It's a biography of Du Bois. And in that book, Du Bois really sort of talks about two waves of the Harlem Renaissance, 1922 to about 1929, and then those who became primarily just writers, not so much the artists, the sculptors, the painters, the singers. And they used the magazines of the NAACP and the Urban League as the vehicles by which they communicated their essays and their poetry. So by 1972, Harlem, like New York City as a whole, was in a kind of an economic funk. Poverty was rampant. The impact of drugs, James Baldwin was saying in his novels that as early as the 1940s, heroin and other drugs had fundamentally redefined what life was like in Harlem, and so it was in a bad way. Folks who couldn't move out had moved out. Most of the beautiful brownstones, even the ones right across the street from Abyssinian, had long since been subdivided into sometimes 8 separate units, 4 floors, 2 units per floor, and each unit, you know, being charged an exorbitant rent. So a lot of landlord abuse of tenants, a lot of neglect from the police department. Yeah, it was a place desperately in need of hope, and about the only folk left. I was watching a Temptations tape last night, pardon this Motown reference, but I was listening to Dennis Edwards say, the only person talking about love now, brother, is the preacher. Nobody's interested in learning but the teacher. That's not where it was. I mean, if you took out the commitment of educators in the schools and the passion of the preachers trying to hold things together, it would have been a pretty glum scenario. So we could have used a Renaissance, but between the Depression and drug addiction, the Harlem Renaissance had pretty much been supplanted.
Wow. How are you looking at things? How are you analyzing the culture? I know you're active at the same time, which eventually gets you and leads you into pastoring. How's that mental progression taking place? Some of the things you're talking about, drugs.
I've been called to the ministry when I was 16 years old, in a fairly dramatic way. but I didn't quite know what to do with the call, which came in 1964.
Tell us about the call.
I'd gone to summer camp. Local church sent its youth out to summer camp to get us out of the city, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a Sunday through Saturday experience. I went to camp because all the girls went to camp. You know, I was not looking for the Lord. I was going to camp because that's where a lot of pretty girls were going. And that was where I was at that time.
Mm-hmm.
Every night during that week, there'd be a preacher who would give a little campsite sermon around a campfire. I have no idea what he was saying because I wasn't interested.
Right.
But on Friday night, he said, now, anybody that is interested in recommitting yourself to Christian living, just to be a better Christian, and he pointed to his left. He said, go over there to a table and take a white candle. Pray about it, and remember in the morning that you've promised to be a better Christian. But he said, if there is somebody here who would like to commit himself to full-time Christian living, full-time Christian ministry, he pointed to his right. You go to the right and you get a pink candle. Pray about it and tell your pastor that you think the Lord is calling you into ministry. Now, Reverend, I know to this day that I took a white candle because preaching was not on my mind. But the next morning, when I picked up my pillow to get ready to leave, the candle was pink. I looked around the cabin to see if anybody was looking at me to laugh about having made the switch on me. Mm-hmm. Nobody paid me any attention. Got to the dining hall. I said, who changed my candle? Nobody paid me any attention. On the bus ride home, what happened to my white candle? Which one of you rascals changed my candle? Nobody said a word. To this day, to this moment, to this conversation,
yes, sir,
God has held me in ministry through mystery. I don't know how that happened, but I have come to believe that it was an act of God. And because I believe that, I have kept a pink candle, you see this?
Yes, sir.
On my desk in some form every day since I was ordained in 1973. And every time I look at this pink candle, I think about ministry and mystery. How did I get here? If you knew who I was and how I was living when this pink candle thing happened, if you knew that I didn't know much about Jesus, but a whole lot about Jack, Jim, and Johnny. Should I explain? Mm-hmm. Jack,
no,
Daniels,
Jim
Beam, Johnny Walker. I knew about them.
Yes, sir.
So those three J's I knew. The other J, not too much.
15.
So here I am talking to you almost 50 years later with the pink candle. And I always ask myself, Lord, why me? And how did you get me from where I was to where I am? I had a girlfriend at that time, and my father died some years later. She came to my father's funeral. Now, here's the thing. She never knew my father because he had died. No, he had left us. He had left us, abandoned us before I met her. So I couldn't figure out why she'd be interested in coming to my father's funeral, but I found out because she knew I was going to be there and she wanted to ask me something, not ask, ask. So I want to ask you a question. I said, what do you want to ask me? She said, I want to ask you how you got from where we were to where you say you are. Because I heard you a preacher. I want to know how you got from where we were to where you say you are, because I know you. And all I could say to her was, well, I can't deny that you knew me, but I very much doubt that you know me now. Wow. What a wonderful change in my heart hath been wrought. since Jesus came into my heart. Floods of joy, oh my soul, like a sea billows roll since Jesus came into my heart.
Yes,
So I got folk all over Chicago who are still wondering how I got from where I was to where I say I am. And my answer is this. It is a ministry of mystery.
Ministry of mystery. Wow. You are going back to Chicago. What church and who was your pastor that you informed to about this pink candle experience?
Yeah, I was not a Baptist then. I belonged to Park Manor Christian Church, which was Disciples of Christ. Well, you know, you went to the church your mother went to. So
right.
I didn't pick it. I just went.
Right.
And when I spoke with him about it, he was very encouraging. But listen, he was also like Ananias, who was sent to Saul, a little suspicious.
Right.
You know, Ananias told the Lord, "Don't you know who Saul is?" And I think my pastor had a sense of who I was, and he's trying to figure out, you know, wait a minute, how did you get from who you were just last weekend to where you say you are, you know, 1 week later? But he was patient, and but nothing happened. I mean, the call took no form except curiosity. It was 2 years later in '66 with King that a form of ministry began to evolve. A ministry that was not just tied to Sunday morning and church liturgy, but could spill over to the streets and over to social issues and over to matters of engagement with the powerful in the city. And then, then Cone, and then, so.
Did you have a trial sermon? Did you preach a sermon, initial
I did,
sermon?
yeah. My trial sermon was Luke chapter 2, verse 52. And Jesus increased in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and man, which was a wonderful text for a boy preacher, because it gave me, these 4 areas in which to aspire for growth: greater wisdom, greater physical stature, greater favor with God, and greater favor with humanity. So yeah, my trial sermon was Luke 2:52. Now think about that. That was in 1965. And I can tell you right to this day, 55 years later, I haven't forgotten what that sermon was.
Yeah, mystery of ministry, yeah. So you're preaching for 2 years. How do you get connected with the organization that connects you to Dr. King?
All right, you asked for it, here it comes. I went to a vocational high school and I studied graphic design and printing.
Wow.
I ran a linotype machine, printing press. Now here's the thing. The only thing that this printing company made, brace yourself, 1966, was Playboy magazine. So I'm almost 18 years old, finished high school, have no college plan whatsoever, because I'm printing Playboy. I get time and a half on Saturday. I get double time on Sunday. Why would I go to church on Sunday when I'm getting double time to print Playboy magazine? One afternoon, I went for my lunch break. And I went to the lunch room and I picked up a local Chicago paper that announced that the next night, I can't recall exactly what day it was, but the next night, Martin Luther King Jr. was going to start an open housing demonstration in Chicago at Liberty Baptist Church around 47th and was then South Parkway. And I said to myself, wow, I've heard about him, I've read about him. It might be nice to go and see for myself, this historic figure. By this time, he'd won the Nobel Peace Prize, twice on the cover of Time magazine. So I decided to go by myself. I just said, I'm going to leave work late, catch the bus. I go right past that church every day anyway. I'm going to get off at 47th Street. And I'm going to go inside of Liberty Baptist Church and wait until he shows up. It was a great service. as packed as you might imagine.
Mm-hmm.
But he wasn't there when the service started. He often came in, once things were already underway.
Mm-hmm.
So I was on the left side of the center aisle. He came in on an aisle to the right of the church, the side aisle. Have you ever seen a wave at an athletic event where the crowd just kind of stands up in a wave?
Yeah.
That's what happened. He came in, and you could see the folks who saw him starting to stand up. And once he became more and more into view, more folks stood up. I didn't see him because he's only 5'7", so the crowd kind of had him obscured until he got up to the pulpit area. Man, the place just went crazy. And so it was impressive. The next Sunday was going to be a big rally at Soldiers Field where the Browns play football. A lot of us went to the rally. And between him preaching and Mahalia Jackson singing, it was a time. The next day was supposed to be a march on City Hall to lay out the demands for which he'd come to Chicago about integration. I went on that. The next Sunday was the first of the marches through these all-white, very inhospitable, very unwelcoming, very dangerous neighborhoods where I would never have gone by myself under any circumstances for fear of death. But we went because that's the whole point. Why do you feel afraid to go to a neighborhood in the city where you were born and raised? So that's what happened. That whole summer got caught up into that. There'd be night meetings, mostly worship services to get you healed up from the day's march and motivated for the next day's march. And a rotation of leadership. James Bevel, Jesse Jackson, Hosea Williams, and Martin King kind of rotated. I never saw Andrew Young much during that summer. He may have been there, but I never really saw him. He may have been someplace else or just, out of sight. That's how it happened. And so I really got involved. I never went back to Poole Brothers. That was what I was looking for. I never printed another issue of Playboy. I looked for a college, found one close to home, started in the fall of 1966. My first class in college was New Testament. It was taught by a white man from New Orleans who had the thickest Southern accent and the reddest neck I ever saw. I could not study with him. I was so furious with all white people at that time. I couldn't discern the good from the bad. I just didn't like white people because of what I'd experienced. It was the only failing grade I ever got in my entire academic career. I failed because I didn't try. I just shut him out. I took the same course the next year with a nice man from Minneapolis, Minnesota, and got an A. The difference was his accent and his neck. He wasn't Southern and he wasn't a redneck, and I could listen to him. I was just that enraged. I calmed down, and wouldn't you know it, that man with the redneck and the thick accent gave me a job as a chaplain at a reform school in St. Charles, Illinois, which, by the way, is the reform school I should have been in myself when I was 16.
Wow.
The irony is I'm a chaplain in a school with boys who were doing then exactly what I had done when I was 16. The difference was I never got caught. That's why my calling is so phenomenal. The Lord knew who I was at 16 and called me anyhow.
So you're there. What's your affiliation with your local church at this point? Are you still at the Discipleship Church, or at what point do you go?
Yeah, because I would go home almost every weekend. So I didn't
Okay.
change denominations till I got to New York.
You got to New York, got you.
Yeah. I got to New York, and I wasn't looking for a church now. I was looking for a civil rights
Yeah,
agency.
I got you.
So I went to Bethany because that's where Operation Breadbasket was.
Got you.
A couple of stories about that. So when I got there, Breadbasket was involved in two national protests, one against the A&P food store and one against a national clothing chain called Robert Hall, both of which had headquarters in Manhattan. And so we were protesting and picketing. The first time I went to a meeting at Breadbasket, Bill Jones invites me to go with him to the headquarters of Robert Hall, 43rd and 5th Avenue, and sit in on the negotiations. Well, yeah, I didn't know Bill Jones. He didn't know me. God, sometimes God just puts you in places that you don't belong.
Right.
But he did. He brought me along, took me under his wing, got me involved in that. Not long after that, we were in a protest with the A&P food store, joined by Ralph David Abernathy, who was now the president of SCLC, and he'd come to support the group. We all got arrested, and guess who I got put in jail with? Ralph David Abernathy. I had a whole night to spend with the president of SCLC, which just, again, reinforced that this was the path that God wanted me to be on. And I just kind of stayed there ever since.
And what eventually leads, your next major move is Cleveland to pastor?
No, my next move was to Montclair, New Jersey to pastor. Sam Proctor was known as someone that churches could call on if they were looking for somebody and didn't want to have a big search. They just wanted somebody that he would endorse. And so after 4 years at Abyssinian, he sent me to this church in New Jersey, St. Paul Baptist Church. They took me on his recommendation. I stayed there for 10 years. He and James Cone together presided at my installation. And so, when you look out from the pew at these two men standing side by side, and next to them was the professor of Old Testament from Union, who had also come, you begin to see your life taking on a certain mosaic, A part of you is purely academic. Part of you is purely pastoral. A part of you is purely protest-oriented. And your job is to make sense out of these pieces. Put them all together. Use what you've learned in seminary. Use the platform that God has given you and advocate on behalf of the people whose condition has touched your heart. And so for 10 years, that's what I did. I was president of the NAACP in Montclair and on the school board, so I could, work outside the church to advance issues of justice and equity. Then I left to go to Cleveland in 1986.
How would you define your time in New Jersey?
It was a great training ground for me. I needed to be in a church where I could test out my mind and my theology and my impulses, these three impulses, academic, pastoral, advocacy. They gave me a wonderful latitude to do that. But eventually I knew I had to go someplace where the reality of life was a lot more front and center. Montclair was a suburban town just outside of New York. It was too sheltered, it was too comfortable. It was, I had to go to Newark to find something to do. You had to go to New York to find a fight.
Yeah.
And so Cleveland offered me all of the inner city blues, to quote Marvin Gaye, that I could handle.
Mm-hmm.
For 24 years, it was the inner city blues that I was trying to play.
How did you hear about the church in Cleveland? What was the process of getting there?
I didn't. They heard about me. I didn't go looking for them.
Mm-hmm.
I think they used the American Baptist. They were an American Baptist church, and St. Paul was as well. All of them dually aligned, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And I was in a national profile bank, in a computer bank,
Mm-hmm.
and they fed in what they wanted, and I came out, and they called me. And I didn't want to go.
Mm-hmm.
At first. I didn't want to go to Cleveland because I didn't know anything about it.
Mm-hmm.
Chicago, I would have gone. New York, I would have gone back. Los Angeles, I would have gone. I'm going to double back to give you a little bit of a Los Angeles story before we're done. But
Okay.
I had no sense of Cleveland. They said, won't you at least come for a tour and a conversation? My wife talked me into going. And when I got there, it was like going to Chicago in a smaller scale. Same kind of city, different Lake Erie, not Lake Michigan. Same ethnic diversity, same, industrial base. So it worked out very well. And for
What was the
24
temperature
years,
of Cleveland that you saw? What was, to get some specifics, what was the temperature of Cleveland when you get there, and that attracted you to it?
Cleveland was a highly organized Black community, and it revolved around Lewis and Carl Stokes and what they call the 21st Congressional District Caucus. So that there was a way that people could channel their concerns every Monday night. There was a place to go. There was an organization to network with. There was a way that you could step in to a leadership position by virtue of being at that church.
Mm-hmm.
If I had not been at Abyssinian, I would not have gone to St. Paul. If I hadn't been at Antioch Baptist Church, I would not have been invited in to the leadership ranks of Cleveland as quickly. So God has always moved me along by virtue of interventions like that. So again, within 2 years of being there, I was the president of the NAACP. Think about that, 2 years, and I served for 2 terms, and got involved in all manner of Cleveland life for the next 24 years. Could have stayed a lot longer, but at the point that I was ready to think about doing something else, I was 62 when I left Cleveland. And I believe then, as I believe now, that church growth is in relationship to the age of the pastor, 10 years older or 10 years younger. When I first went, folk who were joining were 25 to 45.
Mm-hmm.
10 years later, they were 35 to 45. 10 years later, they were 45 to 55. And so I found that other churches with younger pastors were beginning to draw younger families. So I wanted to give Antioch a chance to blossom with the next generation of leadership, and give a younger person the same opportunities that had been given to me. So I left and went to be president at Colgate Rochester Divinity School, where I stayed for 8 years, and then I just retired from that.
Before we get into your time at Colgate, because I definitely want to dig in that, how is your preaching being shaped now? How would you define yourself as a preacher during this time? And how is it being shaped, or some of the people that is helping shape your prophetic voice, if you will?
So you mean during the years in Cleveland? Okay.
Years in Cleveland, Jersey, just
Yeah.
starting with your pastorate. I wanted to go back
Yeah.
as
Yeah. You know, the thing about doing ministry in the New York area is that there is no shortage of role models or opportunities. Think about this. When I went to New York, just in Brooklyn,
right.
Sandy Ray,
Yeah.
Gardner Taylor,
Yeah.
Bill Jones,
Yeah.
Bob Laws, F.D. Washington, just in Brooklyn.
Just a
In New York, when I first got there, Adam Clayton Powell, and then Wyatt Walker, and then Sam Proctor, and then, you know, all the other guys who were in the Baptist Ministers Conference. So my challenge was to find my voice and not copycat a voice, because the voices I was listening to were so powerful, almost addictive, that you would say to yourself, boy, if I could just sound like that, I could get the results that they were getting. So I had to spend some time experimenting with what I believed, with what I thought the gospel meant and said, with how to be relevant in my own context, New Jersey, and then inner city Cleveland, what worked in terms of a call to action in Montclair in the 70s did not work in terms of a call to action in Cleveland in the 90s. So I'm always evolving and trying not to get stuck into a single mode, but never getting too far from a single modality. So here's what I tried to do. And in all the preaching classes that I've taught, I tried to exercise this method. In a book called The Making of a Sermon by a Canadian-born preacher named Robert McCracken, he used in one sentence these four things: kindle the mind, energize the will, disturb the conscience, stir the heart. That's all he said. He didn't give any explanation to it. So for the last 25 years, I've been trying to define those four things as ways to preach. Sometimes you want to kindle the mind, which is to take on the most difficult topics concerning which there is no consensus, and get people to think about these things. Does life begin at conception or at birth? Is homosexuality a matter of behavior or biology? No one sermon is going to resolve things like that, but you can get folks to think for themselves about it and give them the things to think about. So sometimes I want to just get folks' minds at work.
Okay.
Then I want to energize the will. The time to think is done. Now it's time to act, time to do something. Motivate folks, time to march, time to picket, time to demonstrate, time to pray, time to tithe, time to whatever. Then disturb the conscience. People's behaviors need to be confronted and challenged, and conversion is required. That's why both John the Baptist and Jesus, in their first sermons in the Gospel of Mark, preached the same word: repent. So how do you get people to confront and change their conduct? And then stir the heart. Sometimes folks need to hear that God is good, that trouble don't last always, like right now, like this virus is bad, but hope has not gone away. And hallelujah, God is with us. Truth crushed to earth will rise again. The devil is a liar and will be defeated. And you want to stir people's hearts to believe that something better is awaiting them. So I try to get folks to rotate: kindling, energizing, disturbing, stirring. And I got something from Cleophas LaRue in his book, The Heart of Black Preaching, where Cleophas LaRue says there are 5 domains of Black preaching. that trace back to the 19th century. He calls them personal piety, personal spiritual formation, care of the soul, helping folks in times of crisis, social justice, community concerns, by which he meant things that are unique to the Black community that we have to speak to because white folks can't fix it. Why is the Black birth rate so high among teenagers? Why is the high school dropout rate among Black males so high? White folk might not mind that. Black folk ought to be talking about why those things are so. Community concerns. And then the last one was the maintenance of the institutional church. How do you keep church life going? Tithing, volunteers, et cetera, et cetera. So take those two things and put them together. The themes, kindling, energizing, disturbing, stirring, and the practices, piety, personal, spiritual care, care in times of crisis, social justice, community concerns, maintaining the church. If you keep those things in mind, preaching, text selection, topic selection becomes as easy as standing up.
Wow, that's great. So you make the decision to retire from Antioch and Cleveland.
Yeah.
Do you pursue the role of president in academia? Not that particular position, but the ideal of it, the philosophical concept. I want to retire and get into the academic circle, or is it just something that more falls on your lap?
The truth is that I've been teaching in seminary since 1978. I taught at New Brunswick Seminary and New York Seminary when I was still in New Jersey. When I went to Cleveland, I started teaching, and I was at Princeton. I got a D-Min at Princeton in 1983, and then I taught there for 3 years while still pastoring. When I got to Cleveland, I did a PhD at Case Western Reserve, which is just down the street from the church. And I started teaching at Ashland Seminary. And I stayed at Ashland until I left to go to Colgate. I was actually a tenured professor in homiletics and Black church studies at Ashland from 1996 until I retired as professor emeritus. So going to Colgate was easier because I'd spent 15 years as part of a seminary community. And so nothing was really new to me in terms of, the role of the president, the role of trustees, the role of the faculty. I'd seen all that before.
And what led you there? How did you get there?
They called me. I was going to stay at Ashland until, maybe now, because I turned 70, or even later. But now let's back up. Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School. That's its name. When I got a call from Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School, the first thing I thought about were all the people who had impacted my life who went to one of those schools. Martin King went to Crozer. Bill Jones went to Crozer. Sam Proctor went to Crozer. Here I am being asked to be the president of the school where my 3 primary mentors had been students. And it occurred to me that this had to be more of this, more mystery. How do I get from this in 1964 to Colgate Rochester Crozer Divinity School in 2011, not looking for it? Ministry of mystery. It just kept coming. It just kept occurring.
And is there a long application process? Is this a long process? And the reason why I'm asking is because I'm trying to dive into how you are transitioned ministry wise to like full. And I know you studied this and you taught in seminary the whole time, and how that's going to get into what we're facing now. So, do you just they recruit you? Yes,
Yeah,
you walk in the door.
yeah. I mean, with the phone call, would you be interested?
Mm-hmm.
Then there was a phone interview, really about three things. Do you understand administration? Do you understand fundraising? And do you understand academic life? Because those are the things that the president is involved in. So, that went well. Then there was a face-to-face meeting with the Board of Trustees, which went well, went well. Then they made an offer.
Mm-hmm.
They had, I think, 3 candidates. They met them all on the same day in a law firm,
Mm-hmm.
where one of the trustees was a partner. I was the last of the 3. So I was there for about 2 hours, maybe 3 hours, and left. Maybe a week later, they called to make the offer. And my wife and I then had to think about, all that was involved in packing up and relocating and going to a different part of the country. But I kept saying to myself, Colgate, Rochester, Crozer, and the legacy of King and Proctor and Bill Jones and the King Fellows D-Min program was at Colgate. And here again, H. Beecher Hicks was in that program. Wyatt Walker was in that program. Folks from all over the country were there, and they're asking me to carry this legacy on. Every day when I'd go to work, there'd be a picture in a display case just outside my office. A picture of Martin Luther King Jr. at the age of 19 when he applied for admission to Crozer. One letter from him and one letter from his father. He was asking for a catalog, and his father was asking to have his son admitted on the hope that, now hear this, that my son might do well in ministry if he gets the right direction. He might do well, I should say.
Did all right.
Every day I had to pass by that display case on my way to and from work.
Wow.
A reminder of this.
How was your time there? What were some of the challenges? What were some of the successes, some of the highs? I should say more than successes, some of the highs, some of the challenges.
Well, clearly one goes to seminary because one is interested in the future of the church.
Mm-hmm.
And you want to help shape, motivate, encourage, and sometimes redirect people who are lining up for careers in ministry. So I went there because I wanted to have the chance to do for the next generation what C. Eric Lincoln and Lawrence Jones and James Cone had done for me, which was to put a hand on me and move me in a certain direction. Among my great frustrations, one is that seminary life in the country is shrinking as more and more people in the country are gravitating away from regular church life. Fastest growing sector of American society, so far as religious identification is concerned, are nuns, N-O-N-E-S. Folks who don't have a church home, don't want a church home, don't want to hear what the church has to say. So 3 things happen because of that. Fewer people are being shaped in local churches to come to ministry. fewer local churches are subsidizing people in seminary to pay for ministry, and fewer churches can afford to hire seminary-trained people for positions in ministry. So how do you get folks to come to seminary, pay their way through seminary, and get them placed when they graduate was my biggest challenge. And because I've got a long history of advocacy for women in ministry, I have found it increasingly frustrating that younger pastors have begun to pick up the theology of a generation twice removed. 1 Corinthians 14, 1 Timothy 2 argument that women should not be in the ministry in the first place, perhaps because they see them as threats to the positions that they aspire to for themselves. So how do you have a woman in your class who is the best preacher, or a woman in your class who is the best biblical exegete, but then watch somebody else in the graduating class who is a male who does much less well than the woman get to church, while the woman gets passed over and ends up as a chaplain or, you know, something else. So it's painful for me. Now, this is my view of things. To see that we are not always willing to give women in ministry the same opportunities that we give men. I'm writing a book right now called To Set the Captives Free, 50-year retrospective of liberation theology. And right now I'm on the chapter about feminist and womanist theology. And I'm recalling my mother serving on the search committee for a pastor for her church in 1984. And someone said they would rather have a less qualified man than the most qualified woman. That was 1984. There are still churches who feel that same way. And for me, that's heartbreaking. Yeah. So, you know, those are the things I had to struggle with during those years.
Fair enough. You are dealing with this at the same time. How would you define Black liberation theology for someone that may be watching? How would you define that?
Yeah, the argument about Black liberation theology is, let's go back and read what the Bible actually says, because it is inherent in several texts. Luke 4, verses 18 and following, where Jesus announces, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor, liberation to the captives, set the prisoners free, declare the acceptable year of the Lord. That's a quote from Isaiah 61. Mm-hmm. Isaiah 58 has the same thing. Exodus 19 has the same thing. God's interest is that God's people should work for the elimination of all forms of human oppression, mm-hmm. based upon race, based upon class, based upon gender, based upon region of the country. Galatians 3, verse 28 says, if you are in Christ, I hit these three categories: neither Jew nor Gentile, mm-hmm. that's ethnicity; neither slave nor free, that's class; mm-hmm. neither male nor female, that's gender. Those three were the great social barriers of the first century: ethnicity, class, gender. In one verse, Paul says, if you with the Lord Jesus, those three things are the things you are opposed to: discrimination based upon ethnicity, discrimination based upon class, discrimination based upon gender. Liberation theology says, let's set those captives free, because that is the will of God. And if the only thing you do is focus on personal salvation, I've been saved, I'm living a holy life, I'm going straight to heaven, full of the Holy Ghost, baptized and fire-filled, all right. Then get ready to meet him in heaven and have him say to you out of Matthew 25, I was hungry, I was thirsty, I was naked, I was a stranger, I was sick, I was in prison, and you didn't do anything about it. Rather than going straight to heaven, you're going straight to hell because you were not involved in these liberation tasks. You cannot read the Bible and not embrace that it is essentially not about personal salvation, but about social engagement and social responsibility. Go tell Pharaoh, let my people go. But then the prophet goes to the king and says, you are also practicing social injustice because you allow unjust scales, you abuse the poor, you sell folk into debtors' prison. Folk who read Amos chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8 cannot come away and not know that God is opposed to all forms of economic injustice. So what liberation theology wants to do is to say, this is the Bible, this is the story, this is the message. And our job is to say it in those critical moments when injustice is creeping in on us. And unless somebody blows the trumpet before it's too late, evil will just take hold of us. Now, we're there right now. We're there right now. I believe, I don't know what your listeners believe, I don't know what you believe, it's not my business. I believe that the President of the United States is an existential threat to the safety of the globe. That everything he is doing endangers both the environment and human life. And that the way in which he is self-aggrandizing himself every day, while this pandemic sweeps across the country, and he says, I'm not going to send any help to Washington State or New York State or to Virginia or Michigan, because those governors don't say enough good things about me. But he'll send stuff to people who stroke his ego. This is where preachers ought to be rearing up and saying, people are suffering and dying, and he is withholding the authority of his office, only unleashing it on behalf of those who say nice things about him. No. If you can't find something to preach about during this coronavirus 19 thing, if you cannot see that African Americans are now being shown to be the disproportionate victims of this virus based upon generations of disproportionate social disadvantage, underinvestment in terms of housing, underinvestment in terms of employment, underinvestment in terms of access to medical insurance, underinvestment in terms of access to quality food and medicine, underinvestment in terms of pre-existing conditions. The reason we're dying is not because of today. The reason we're dying is because for the last 100 years, we've been on a path that has led us to a level of vulnerability that is only being exposed by coronavirus. And our job is not just to preach about the virus. The virus will go at some point. These underlying social issues, poverty, a lack of quality education, a lack of affordable health care, living in food deserts where there's no grocery store, living in a pharmacy desert where you can't get to the drugs that you need. These things are going to go on and on and on unless some angry preachers rise up and call attention to it. I don't mean on Sunday morning. We aren't going to save the world from the safety of our pulpits. Somebody has to go to these places of power and authority and influence, like we did in the 70s, sit in, get arrested, go to jail, picket, protest, wear these people down until they finally begin to see what justice looks like. That's what you have to wear people down.
Well,
show up and keep showing up.
Speak to those of us that of a younger period, that have not experienced the firsthand outright racism, much like your generation, generations before that, the more systemic structural things, which you went right into it where I wanted to go next, your article, the mortality rate of COVID-19 within African-American communities. And we'll talk about how we can get those resources definitely in a second here. But how do you challenge someone like maybe even myself or others who would stress doctrine, who would stress, saved by grace and not by works, and the need to maybe, at least in my opinion, still maintain those pillars, but marry that with more active action and pulling in, we are his workmanship, that we're not saved by works, but we're saved for works, and how social justice need to be in that work. How do you challenge us? And then if someone's hearing this and they're convicted, what would you say would be some of the first steps that they could do to start moving in that direction?
Yeah, no generation of African Americans up to and including this moment is untouched by racism. It just takes on different forms. Every time you hear about voter suppression and the desire of people to keep people from voting by requiring things that make voting more difficult, you're talking about white supremacy and efforts by white society to keep their power. When you look at the rate of investment in inner city public schools as opposed to suburban schools, you're talking about racism taking a particular form. When you look at the degree to which Black people with the highest degrees from the finest law schools and the finest medical schools and the finest engineering schools can still not have the same access to employment, to become partners or to become doctors with admission privileges at the frontline hospitals. It still goes on. Mm-hmm. So you have to know what to look for. Don't look for a colored sign, or you got to sit in the back of the bus. We fought those battles, and that's pretty much done. The question is, where are the glass ceilings today? Where are the places where African Americans are not present? Look at the United States Senate. Look at the number of African American governors in countries, in states around this country. Name for me, if your viewers can, at this point in time, one African American governor in the United States of America. Wow. One, much less two. So once you reach a certain level of achievement, there's always some other level that is still waiting to be penetrated. So we penetrated, racism in its rawest forms. We stood down the Ku Klux Klan. My generation confronted all of that so that your generation wouldn't have to. The question is, how do we move the ball forward? Let's think about this as a relay race. My grandmother, born in 1879 in Kentucky, ran the first lap, working for 5 cents an hour ironing the sheets of white people. My mother ran the second leg of the race and never earned more than $12,000 in her life. I ran the third lap of the race and earned more in my first job at Abyssinian than my mother earned at the end of her career. Now, the next generation, that's people of your generation, my son's generation, they have to take the baton and move the issue forward to whatever are the still unresolved issues of social inclusion. The reason we have a Black Lives Matter movement is not because of what happened in 1960. It's because of all the Black folk who've been shot and killed by the police in the last 10 years. So there's plenty of work to be done. Now, the question is, who will do it? The reason you can name all of the biblical prophets on your hands and toes and have some toes left over is because there weren't enough of them. Most Black pastors, like most white pastors, will never get around to this. They'll find that it is much easier and much safer to stay in church and preach doctrine. You don't get shot for preaching doctrine. You won't be criticized for preaching doctrine. You won't have to risk losing the church preaching doctrine. So most folks never will. Bill Jones used to say to us, the work of justice is always the work of a small minority. The question is, who has the courage to join the small minority? The ball is advanced by folks whose names we know because there weren't that many of them. I was in Chicago in 1966. I know that because of Joseph H. Jackson, 98% of the Black preachers in Chicago did not participate. You hear me? Did not participate in the civil rights movement. It was 2% of them who did. Clay Evans, who just died, stood against Joseph Jackson in defense of Martin King when Jackson wanted no Black pastor in Chicago to support what King was doing. When Clay Evans stood against J.H. Jackson in support of King, Evans was in the middle of a building program for his church. Jackson had so much power with downtown Chicago, he had all the building permits for Clay Evans' church pulled. And for 7 years, Clay Evans' building program was stopped because he was determined to support King no matter what. Not many other preachers were prepared in Chicago to risk anything for the sake of what King was doing. Now, you go back, it seems as if every Black preacher in town was at the March on Washington and in Selma and in Birmingham. Sure, 50 years later, I was there. No, you weren't. You were not there. You were not there. You were not there. I don't want many folks, Reverend, I don't want many folks to get the call to do this. Service of justice. He said, I've given 40 years of my life. I want you to give 40 years of your life to this work. Calvin Butts is a 40-year man.
It was a freeze. My apologies. It was a freeze, and I don't want it to be lost. Can you repeat like the last 30 seconds or so?
Yeah. When I started at Abyssinian, Sam Proctor's challenge to us was, I need a 40-year man. By which he meant he had spent 40 years of his life working on issues of justice. He had watched Benjamin Mays spend 40 years of his life on issues of justice. He had watched Du Bois spend 40 years of his life working on justice. He had watched Fred Douglass spend 40 years of his life working on justice. Calvin Butts and I left Abyssinian committed to being what we call 40-year men.
Mm-hmm.
And we have been. Our job now is to say to the next generation, how will you spend the next 40 years of your life? And if the answer is, I'm going to spend the next 40 years, with convention work and, at conferences and, building my ministry, okay, that's fine. I need somebody who's going to spend 40 years with a little anger and a little edge in terms of social injustice. So what I'm looking for are 40-year people, men and women, who will not get distracted by the things you can do in church that cost you nothing and benefit you greatly, but commit to those things which may have a consequence. You may not make as many friends or get as many invitations. The fact that I am outspokenly in favor of women in ministry has cost me some things that people might otherwise have asked me to do.
Mm-hmm.
I know that there are things in my life that I've not been invited to do because of stands that I have taken that were matters of personal integrity. I can live with that. My question is, who in your generation and those right behind you, what will you spend the next 40 years doing that benefits the broader work of the kingdom of God and doesn't just advance your own ministry? That's all.
Yeah, powerful question. Let's get into COVID-19. I recommend that everyone read your article, the mortality rate of COVID-19 with African-American communities. I want to go sort of major point by major point, if you will, with that, starting with the staggering death rate, disproportionate death rate among African-American community. I've obviously read it and know why, but I just want to give you an opportunity to say, talk more about that, how that exists, and the root cause analysis behind it, and some of your personal experiences and seeing that it manifest itself.
Yeah, I wrote this for a Facebook post, first of all, and then for my local newspaper that picked it up, and then a magazine called Christian Citizen that's going to print it. Because it was becoming apparent that in the middle of the COVID-19 discussion, suddenly we began to see that the people who were dying from it, not just infected by it, but dying from it, were disproportionately African American.
Okay.
And I might add, Native American. The hotspots for COVID-19 were inner city New York, inner city Boston, inner city Detroit, inner city Chicago, inner city Milwaukee, inner city New Orleans. Chicago, the Black population is 30%. Death from COVID is 70%. 70% of the people who died from COVID-19 in New Orleans, in Boston, in New York, in Chicago, in Milwaukee are Black. That didn't always being reported. It's been reported more now than before.
Yeah.
The question is why? Not because COVID does not affect other people. It's because the number of people that had been affected and died had pre-existing conditions. High blood pressure, diabetes, heart disease, forms of cancer, obesity, and in addition to pre-existing conditions, they had jobs that would not allow them to stay at home and work. Bus drivers, grocery clerks, home health care aides, nurses in hospitals who are disproportionately African American can't do those jobs from home. So they are the ones who are more exposed to the virus, who have the least resistance to the virus, and because they don't have the same access to health care, weren't always being given the same treatment for the virus. So part of what I wanted to do was to call attention to the fact that African Americans and Native Americans are dying faster than any other group. And after the COVID-19 has passed away, the causes for their death, diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease, obesity, lives, jobs that put them right in front of the public, a lack of access to affordable health care, living in a food desert, living in a pharmacy, those things will continue. Will we spend as much time talking about those conditions after the virus as we have during the virus?
Or would we be talking about them if it only affected us?
Well, now you see, there you go. My fear is that one of the reasons why folks want to get beyond the discussion, let's just get back to work, let's just get back to school, let's just get back to our face-to-face meetings, because the folk who are dying, we don't care about them anyway. Let them die. When you hear people say, well, listen, we can live with a certain percentage of death and life can go on, yeah, but who's dying? So
exactly.
even now, Black life, brown life is being minimized because our death doesn't seem to mean as much to society as if it was a 70% white death rate, which it is not.
Wow. You talked about the fact that will there be news conferences, will there be governors upset, and your hypothetical was meant to be rhetorical. And if this continues at the rate for African Americans or the issues that are underlining that is causing this disproportionate effect on African American mortality, death on African Americans, how do we, if the governors don't do it, if the president doesn't do it, if the mayor doesn't do it, how do we continue these conversations? How do we align ourselves? I think the jealousy that I would have of your generation opposed to ours is that you all had these organizations, these structures. So you could not know King personally, but be involved what he was doing in Chicago because of the organizational structure that was there. How can we create that? How can that be evolved? How can we lean on people like yourself with the resources and access to get those things done and create those things?
You know what we did not have that you do have? What we're doing right now.
Okay.
We didn't have this. We didn't have Instagram, Facebook, Zoom conferences. We didn't have networks of preachers having conferences about everything else that's going on in the country. We didn't have these social media platforms and the opportunity to communicate our message electronically. You have right now, and your network of preachers has right now, a platform from which you can keep this conversation going until the matter is resolved. The question is, are these the kinds of themes and topics that people will tune into and respond to? What are your ratings for today's discussion? Have no way of knowing. But you have what we didn't have. We had to do these things in order to attract the news media. We'd have marches and sit-ins and demonstrations in the hope that one television camera would come and put it on the nightly news. You are the nightly news.
Mhm.
Zoom conferences, preaching to people by way of satellite connections gives us a chance to communicate a message en masse that never existed. We had to go to Washington, D.C. in 1963 in order to attract a national audience. You can sit in your church and can reach out to your peers and can initiate a conversation that can touch every corner of this country. Technology is your gift. Street corners were our platform. Not your, you don't have to have a street corner protest. You can convene this way. And I would urge every pastor who is technical, has tech savvy, to see this as, Paul had to go into all the world because there was no other way to get the word out. It was oral for the first 1,500 years. Then came the printing press, and suddenly we could write the story. Then came electricity and the radio and the television. We could communicate that way. Now, people are born into a world of technological sophistication. iPhones, iPads, laptops, satellite connections. You can tell the story sitting right where you are if it's the story that has the potential to transform the world. So I write one article, put it on Facebook. How do you suppose it got from my Facebook page to you?
Right, technology.
Technology. I didn't send it to you. I just posted it. Different ones saw it. They would share it. Somebody else saw it. They would share it. You can do as much with a Facebook post as you can with 10 sermons. If what you post is worth reading and worth sharing. Amen. So I'm trying to say, here's what I'm modeling. I'm trying to model, the life of a writer. I'm trying to model the life of an activist. I'm trying to model what can be done if you run the risk of putting your ideas in a public platform and letting the world come back to you, both to critique it and to applaud it. But it all involves risk. It all involves saying, I'm going to say what I think. Let's see what comes next. Say it. Say what you think. See what comes next. Give me just one 30-second pause to speak to my wife. I'll be right back. Don't go away.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We're here live with Dr. Marvin McMickle, and we are being amazed by his perspective. He have shared with us so much about his life, about his story, and
I'm back.
the opportunity to do that has been grateful. I wanna talk about then. You brought it up with James Jackson.
Yeah.
And I don't know your affiliation with any conventions now or any conferences or even universities. How do you critique that, and how would you say, as it makes to the major structural systems that we should be leaning on during these times that seems like they have the mind state to be where what many of the things that you talked about today?
Yeah, well, not surprisingly, because of Martin King, I was a member of the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which came into existence in 1961 as a split from the National Baptist Convention over the role of Martin Luther King Jr. So in 1961.
Were you in Kansas City for that?
No, I was too young for that. I was 13 at that time. But I joined the convention when I went to St. Paul in New Jersey.
Okay.
So I've been a member since 1977.
And which convention was this?
Progressive National Baptist Convention.
Progressive, yes, sir.
Yeah.
Sir.
And so last year I was the leader of the pastors division at the convention, along with Gary Simpson from Concord Baptist Church in Brooklyn, and Jacqueline Thompson, who's the new pastor of Allen Temple Baptist Church in Oakland. I'm of that generation that's still holding out hope that these conventions can do something more than have fellowship. National conventions ought to have national agendas. If the National Baptist Convention has 5 million members, then it ought to feel like that in the country. Like when it puts its foot down, 5 million feet have just stomped at one time. But I don't feel that right now. I'm aware of lots of conferences that have gone on. I'm all for conferences and for, iron sharpening iron, and for fellowship and for spiritual formation. I have no problem with it. I just hope that there's something more to it than just fellowship. I hope that when we get together, we're sharing best practices of ministry. We are sharing the aches and sorrows of different parts of the country. We are collaborating with one another in times of crisis. We're mentoring the next generation to follow in our footsteps. We're making ourselves available. The reason why I'm doing this is because when I reached out to older pastors when I was young, not one of them ever said no to me. They never said, I'm too busy. They never said, I don't really know you, I'm not going to do it. There was a mindset of the generation before me that said, whatever I can do to help the next generation of preachers, I'm going to do it. And so when you call me, I didn't ask you, does it pay? I didn't ask you, I don't care. You asked me, would I come on your program? How long did it take me to say yes?
1.5 seconds.
1.5 seconds, yeah, sure. Now, you did say one thing. You did say that Ralph West had given you my number.
Yeah, I did drop his name.
So based upon my regard for him, if he thought enough of you to have you call me, that's all I needed. He was my introduction to you. All of us are introduced to other people by somebody else. There's a third party.
Yes, sir.
And so let's help each other by using our networks to advance our ministries.
Absolutely. You've been gracious with your time. I want to be able to reach out again and talk to you again on both personal and this level. So I want to be gracious with that, but I do want you to tell us where we can find your information, your books that you have wrote, how we can get those books, and then what you're working on now. Yeah. And just your whole temperature right now in light of the COVID-19. I just want to give you a chance to do that on as freely as you feel comfortable.
Let me end with this. All my books are on Amazon. So if you go to Amazon.com and type in my name, I've done 17 books so far, and they'll all pop up right away. I've done books with Judson Press, Pilgrim Press, and Fortress Press. Okay. But Amazon will have all of them, and they're all available. Almost all of them can be accessed by electronic Kindle. Okay. So you can have a Kindle, and you can download them all right onto your Kindle. Now, here's why. I committed myself years ago to a ministry that involved both oral and written communication. I'm a preacher, so I believe in preaching. Mm-hmm. But because I was also an academic, I also believe that there is an obligation on the part of some of us to commit ourselves to a ministry of writing. Writing so others can read and be helped. Writing is by definition solitary. You can't be at every conference. You can't be at every workshop. You can't be at every convention. You can't be at everything and write 17 books. Writing draws you away. It isolates you long enough for you to research a footnote, to track down a reference. You're doing the spade work for the benefit of those who can then read the book and get the data that you've just dug up for them. In addition to asking your listeners and your colleagues and your peers to be activists, I want some of them to be writers too, to take the time to write about their experiences, to do theology from their point of view, to tell their own story, because a book will take you where your body may never go. So my heart is to get out of myself everything I want to say and motivate others to do the same thing. I see all those books behind you, on the shelf behind you. I hope that many of your viewers will add to that shelf with their own books. Start with articles, essays, Facebook posts, but keep writing. Writing becomes easier, like preaching becomes easier the more you do it.
Yes, sir. We receive that. I want you to pray for us in closing. I want to thank you again for taking time out to do this. I want to thank you for your years of advocacy, your years of pastoral service, your years of being a community organizer and developer, and hopefully in these coming days, weeks, months, and years, we could partner more on some things. My mind is rolling like it was when I read your article, and is especially rolling now after talking to you for now here almost 2 hours, which has been joy. Don't seem like it. And when those things occur, some of the things that I am thinking about, just know we'll be reaching out to you for your expertise and input and insight to that, both formally and informally. So you can go ahead and save my number. You got a new stalker.
I got it. Yeah, I got it. And I just sent you something else. So yes, take a look at that. And here's what happens. I was asked to write something for a newspaper because of something I had written earlier. This is the way this works. Okay. You hear somebody preach, and then you invite them to come preach for you, and it goes on that way. The same thing is true in writing. Somebody reads what you wrote, and they ask you to write some more. So between your oral and your writing ministry, serve the kingdom. So let's pray about it.
Yes,
God, how thankful we are for this marvelous opportunity to share in this ministry, this Zoom conversation, this 21st century technology by which we can reach out and touch the lives of people and preachers and churches all across the country and all around the world. So bless this conversation, bless this format, bless this preacher who has hosted today's discussion. Guide and direct him as he uses his platform to invite people on who can speak to our hearts and challenge us and broaden us in our understandings, take us into places we might otherwise never venture. So bless him and use him to your glory and to our good. Bless everybody who is a part of this time together, this Zoom, Facebook Live discussion. Whoever they are, Lord, stir up in them a sense of passion for justice, a sense of conviction for ministry, a recollection of how they were called and what God has called them to do and to be. Give them a sense of their gifts and then a passion to use those gifts to the glory of God. Now dismiss us in this turbulent time with the virus running rampant all around us. Keep us safe from sickness and death. Keep us encouraged in the face of these dangers. Keep us bold in what we say and what we write and how we live. Lord, be pleased with us and make us a blessing. In your name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Thank you again. And I know you had an LA story.